Ja, einen schönen guten Abend allerseits. Herzlich willkommen zum Transatlantic Tuesday des Karl-Schurz-Hauses. Der zweite Versuch. Ich bitte Sie ganz kurz zu schauen, dass Sie auch Ihre Tonfunktion ausschalten, einfach damit die Tonqualität für alle besser ist. Also wenn Sie quasi noch nicht gemutet sind, würde ich Sie bitten, das kurz zu tun, damit es keine Störgeräusche gibt. Vielen Dank. Ja, ich sagte gerade schon, es ist der zweite Versuch. Wir hatten ganz extreme technische Probleme beim ersten Versuch mit Julia Phillips und haben jetzt eine Mischung aus neuen und aus alten Gesichtern in der Veranstaltung. Ich freue mich, dass Sie wieder dabei sind. Ich freue mich auch über die, die sich zum ersten Mal zugeschaltet haben. Unser Dank gilt auch dem Freiburger Literaturhaus und dem Tsvetajewa-Zentrum an der Universität Freiburg, die diese Veranstaltung unterstützen, mit denen wir kooperiert haben dafür. Das freut mich sehr. Ich möchte Doris Wolters auch vorstellen, die sehen Sie vielleicht auch schon, je nachdem wie Ihre Ansicht ist, bekannt aus Arte und SWR, die heute Abend eine Lesestelle aus der deutschen Übertragung des Romans lesen wird für uns. Zuvor sage ich noch ein ganz paar Worte zur Autorin und zu ihrem Roman, die Sie hier schon sehen. Ja, es geht um, wie die New York Times sagte, ein hervorragendes Debüt, einen nahezu makellosen Roman. Das sagt die New York Times über die erste Veröffentlichung der amerikanischen Autorin Julia Phillips, die auf der Shortlist für den National Book Award stand und zu den 10 Best Books der New York Times im Jahr 2019 zählte. 10 Jahre hat Phillips an ihrem Buch gearbeitet. Das ist ganz beachtlich, sollte man vielleicht auch mal erwähnen. Die Badische Zeitung hat eine große Besprechung gebracht, haben Sie vielleicht gesehen im Vorfeld, und nannte das Buch bewundernswert. Worum geht es in wenigen Worten? An einem Augustnachmittag werden auf Kamtschatka, der abgelegenen rauen Halbinsel ganz am nordöstlichen Rand von Russland, 2 junge Schwestern entführt. In den folgenden Monaten verlaufen die polizeilichen Ermittlungen vollkommen ergebnislos. Das Echo des Verschwindens dieser beiden Mädchen, das hallt quasi erdbebenartig durch die gesamte Gemeinschaft auf dieser abgelegenen Halbinsel und erinnert besonders die Frauen in dieser Community an einen ähnlichen schrecklichen Vorfall in der indigenen Bevölkerung, der noch nicht lange her ist. Phillips erzählt anhand von einem Reigen englischer Stimmen, die durch ungelöste Verbrechen, Rivalitäten und Geheimnisse verbunden sind, wie das Leben in einer gespaltenen, männerdominierten Gesellschaft und im Schatten der verschwundenen Sowjetunion aussieht. Das Verschwinden der Erde, das ist der deutsche Titel auf DTV, bei DTV erschienen, entführt uns in die Welt einer Vielfalt unvergesslicher Frauenschicksale und auch in die spektakulären Weiten der Tundra, der schneebedeckten Vulkane, der eisigen See und in die graue postindustrielle Stadt Petropavlovsk. Ganz kurz noch zu Julia Phillips und dann kommen wir ins Gespräch. Julia Phillips ist Fulbright-Stipendiatin, da dieses Stipendium hat sie genutzt, um diesen Roman zu schreiben, das sollte man erwähnen. Sie ist in New Jersey aufgewachsen, lebt jetzt in Brooklyn mit ihrer Familie. Sie hat schon für die New York Times, den Atlantic und The Paris Review geschrieben. Sie unterrichtet kreatives Schreiben am Randolph College in Lynchburg, Virginia und hat ihren Roman bisher in 25 Sprachen übersetzen lassen. Ganz beachtlich, besonders für ein Debüt. Ja, so viel erstmal zur Einleitung. Ich freue mich, dass Sie hier sind und ich freue mich sehr, dass Julia Phillips hier ist. Welcome, Julia. It's a pleasure that you're here again.
I'm so glad to be here again. Hi. Hi, everybody.
And a few people are waving already. That's especially nice. So I will try to get a little bit of a different start than our ill-fortunate first try, because it got me to thinking about the book again in a new way, of course, because you have to reorder your thoughts, not to get in the same patterns that led to not the outcome we hoped for. But it's also a chance, I think, to think about something for a second time or maybe even a third time. And so I've listened to you talk a lot about how the book came to be, how you went to Kamchatka and lived there, lived among the people as well, researched the book, not knowing what would be the outcome in the beginning. And then I got to thinking, like the the thing to write right now is like a first-person memoirish adventure narrative, maybe like a singular being moving out into the world, finding themselves. It's often quite autobiographical, and that could have been your book too, I think. It would have been quite easy, but you've done the exact opposite. It's a novel of community, community that comes together, that's also isolating from each other in other ways. So I was wondering, was there ever a temptation to write this kind of book, or was this always the plan?
Well, I really like your description. Well, I love your description of Disappearing Earth. And I also really love your description of this first-person memoirish adventure novel. That sounds like a lot of fun, and I want to read that a lot. It was never the plan. It was never my plan for this book. And I think, to tell the truth, I love fiction that is not that. I love fiction. I should say I love to, when I write fiction, and fiction's what I really love to write, I really love to move away from myself and my own experiences, and it's hard for me to write if it feels too close to me, and too close to my perception of the world, or you know, if the situation is something that's happened to me myself. The more details or character or situation I can change, the freer I feel to write about something. And I love fiction for that. I think in my daily life, I imagine in all of our daily lives, we spend a lot of time in our own heads with our own bodies thinking like, I do this, I do that, here I go, here I am. And so it's not necessarily when we have time to imagine, it's not necessarily the thing that we want to imagine that over again. Or at least for me, I like to try to imagine something else. And I find that to be really freeing and really exciting. That being said, in the book as it's written, the book, as you say, Renee, of a community of all these different people, I think there's a lot more of me in there than I admit to myself or want to see, perhaps. I'm definitely in there all over the place. But for me, fiction, third person is always the most alluring way to do it. A situation that is not my own is always the most exciting and first thought.
Connected to that, maybe, the book came out in English in the original version in 2019, and now it's coming out in a quite different global situation in many other countries, Germany amongst them, where it came out this spring, actually. And to me, it did get connected to this whole debate we have right now in Western society, especially. I'm not sure how it's playing out in other societies as well, but we had 30 or 40 years of individualism as the main principle of organizing public life and economies and all kinds of things. And now there's a lot of talk about maybe going back to something that's more collective, because we feel how vulnerable single people are, individuals are. And your book shows that, like, almost in a prophetic way, I think, because these people are in different circumstances and basically being forged by the Soviet history, which had a very special kind of relationship with collectivism as well, which is different to the West. They are lonely often. They're often connected in ways we in the West maybe aren't anymore. I was actually thinking if your own frame of reference about this kind of connection issue in the book has changed since you first wrote it.
That is so interesting. It's so interesting to think about. I'm glad to hear in your experience that people are having more conversations, our countries or cultures or societies about collectivism and the benefits of it, because I'll say that from my vantage point here in the United States, I don't think we're having enough conversation about that at all. It seems to not be a conversation that is even entertained in the public sphere, and that's really challenging. It's so interesting to hear you say that. I think my feelings about it have changed over the past couple of years in that they've gotten stronger. When I wrote this book, a big argument of the book for me is the moral argument of it, really, like the point, what I think of as the sort of moral point is that that community is how we save each other, that we come together to hurt people, and that because we come together to hurt people, we can also come together to help people. And that there isn't one brilliant detective or genius police officer or one savvy person in charge who figures everything out and sets everything right. Everyone is able to come together. Everyone is able to work together in order to address what's gone wrong or right what's wrong. In the same way that, when there is great harm being done in society, the authorities are not are the symptoms and not the disease. That all of us participate in and are complicit with that harm. To me, that the structure of the book is intended to argue for that. And in the couple of years since it's come out here in the US, I think I feel that more strongly all the time. I think having had the opportunity of, before COVID, getting to travel a little bit with the book and talk to people about it, or even now, the opportunity to be with you all and hear different people's, take of it and read of it and their interpretation, their experiences, has really helped me connect to an even larger community than I had before, meet new people and understand different people's ways of seeing things, or at least listen to and try to understand different people's way of seeing things. And that's made me more convinced than ever that community is essential, that the way that we act for the good has to be acting together, because acting alone, we can't really do anything at all. We have no impact on our own. And I think certainly the pandemic and the way it's been handled here domestically for me in the US, and the news I read around the world, and every headline I read about the pandemic or about anything makes me more and more convinced of that all the time. I really do think collectivism, I think that's what society is, right? That's why we have a country or a town or a government or a family or a group of friends. Like it seems that our nature is to function in concert, not to be individuals struggling and failing to survive. And so I feel that very strongly, and I'm really, it's gratifying to me and illuminating to me that is a thought that the book sparks for you, or one that you've been thinking about lately, perhaps independent of the book.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really connected, and actually that leads me to something which I've skipped in my first questions, but which is always a good place to start, which is the beginning of the book. I gave a very brief overview about how the book starts in German in the beginning, but it's actually interesting how reviewers, and I mean almost all of the reviews in both English and German were extraordinary and very positive. But it's actually interesting that lots of reviewers really remarked upon the book starts as a detective novel and true crime, and people get abducted and there's a detective and then she does something completely different. What is this? And so people reacted quite strongly, even people who professionally engage with literature, quite strongly with this narrative rupture. And I think it's a brave thing to do, because the book spirals into this circle of stories. It's almost a little bit like this traditions like this in European literature, where it's like a story, it's actually called like a dance of stories almost in a vague translation in Austrian literature, for example. And people still like hamper for the one detective making everything right again. And I think it's quite brave that the book very boldly states that this is not going to be the case. Like, something happens and other things happen as well, and we have to deal with all of it together and on our own. So I was wondering if you, was it like taking, did it like require braveness to write it like this? Or was it clear to you that this is the only way to tell people about this story?
I think it was much more of the latter. I love the idea of framing it as brave and bold and intentional and very smart of me that I was, making these choices to. I really love to read literary thrillers, thrillers that, or detective stories that maybe have some play about structure or point of view character or time that tell a very engaging story and also tell it in a way that is engaging. And I wanted very much to do that. I really, really wanted in this, and I want in general in my career to write literary thrillers. I think that's so fun and cool. They're my favorite kind of book to read. So when I was thinking about this, I knew that I wanted to start with this disappearance of the girls. I knew I wanted that to be sort of the big question pulling us through the book. What happened to these girls? Will we find them? Who took them? That was the question that I wanted to have answered by the end. And I wanted that to really fuel us through the whole thing. I also wanted to tell the story in a way that I found engaging as a writer, because I thought that engagement would have an idea about writing or about art making in general, that the way that the author feels or the way that the artist feels is the way that it like translates magically through the art to the person who is receiving it on the other end. And sometimes I'll read books or where for a paragraph I get bored and then I think, oh, the author must have been bored in this paragraph. This must have been a paragraph that they just felt they had to write just to get out of their way. Or because in the next paragraph you're right back in and it pulls you in. There's something magical, I think, about what's going on there. So with that idea in mind, I thought I want to write something that's really engaging and new to me. So in the hope that one day someone will read it and it'll be really engaging and new to them. And one thing that was new to me was that the experience I had up to that point, certainly, and continue to have in my life, of how violence is perpetrated, how it's experienced, how it's addressed, how police investigations go. It is not, unfortunately, Sherlock Holmes, sort of like seeing the clue and deducing it all perfectly. He must have been left-handed and therefore the killer is this person. I wish that the system of addressing crime was so clean and simple, but in my experience, it is not. It is a big spiral and a lot of chance and a lot of happenstance, and a lot of people have information but that don't know they have information, or they help perpetrate in a way that they help something bad happen. Something bad is a glib way to say it, but they help someone be harmed, or they participate in the harm themselves, or they do things that kind of reinforce the idea that it's okay to hurt, this kind of person, this part of society, these people, and we reinforce for each other that that's fine and that's permissible and actually encouraged a lot of the time, and that's no big deal. In my mind, that that's how it happens. And so I'm really interested in stories about how that whole system functions. And when I was writing this story, I thought, well, I want to write this literary thriller. I want it to be very exciting, and I want it to be new to me. And the new part of it to me is going to be that I want to really focus on the, I want to cast a wide net over a lot of people who are participating. I want to try to reflect that. Because even sometimes the news stories I read don't seem to me to, I love to read a news story. I love to read a book that shows how many people play a part in a single act. That's really interesting to me.
So yeah, that actually brings me to moving on from the beginning, and we won't spoil the end, of course, because people should read the book. And it's not a completely open end, I'm going to say. But moving on from there, and you've mentioned violence already, because that's the elephant in the room in the book, of course. And I've tried to flip through the book again in advance once more, and I feel like I've read it 3 times now.
I'm sorry.
It's actually fun because you can tell it's such a vertigo. Like, chapters are not where you thought they would be, and it's really interesting. It's like it reorders itself while like revisiting it. And something that came to me, I was thinking a lot about violence and community while I've first read it, and now I thought lots of these stories are actually quite neatly characterized by the polarity of care versus carelessness. And in different kinds of senses, like people care for each other in quite literal senses, like young people care for old people, mothers care for children, people care for people they might be attracted to, or they are in a relationship with, or maybe not. And there's also elements of carelessness, like carelessness can lead to violence, to minor, to major violence. It can also just lead to your friend's dog being gone suddenly because you're stupid and you keep the door open. And it's so interesting to me. Is that something you actively think about, like how to be a caring person in different senses in the world, and also as a writer, like avoiding carelessness? Is that a good literary principle, do you think?
Gosh, I love that. I love the way you framed that. I think you put it better than I have ever found the words to put it to myself. I certainly think that you know, I promise that I'm answering your question, even though I'm starting my answer pretty far afield, I promise. I think sometimes, you know, there's always the question of like the art and the artist. And if you have an artist who is, well, I'm going to try not to curse, but, you know, someone whose behavior you really disagree with, who's maybe not your favorite person, what is it like to engage with their art, or is their art totally separate from them, or, you know, can we only ethically consume the art of artists that we think are fantastic people? I think this is a question, of course, that we ask about art and also about history and about all sorts of, and it's always interesting to me because no one is a perfectly ethical person all the time who is just wonderful in every way and angelic and never makes an error. And so to make your decisions as a consumer of art about the moral fiber of the artist seems fruitless in a big way. And yet, it's really interesting to me to reflect on how I think there are qualities, not speaking for other people, but speaking for myself. I can feel that as I grow as a person, I grow as a writer too, that the more I learn as a human being, the more the work grows. And when I expend more effort to, as you say, like, be careful, be attentive, care about other people and about details and listen and note what's going on, the work also is greatly enriched because it then has more detail and more care and more attention and more, that those qualities feed each other. And certainly, so certainly that's something I think about a lot in terms of like how to be a good person in the world. Good person is like all these, I think I'm using good and bad to more easily in conversation right now than I think about them in my head, but trying to be a caring person in the world and trying to create work that is truthful and humane and that folks can connect to. Those seem really coupled to me. And so it's certainly a big concern of mine, something that's on my mind a lot. I'll also say the characters in the book, the way that they care for or are careless about each other, it really, it's like, we talked before about, violence, harm enacted by a community, like how that happens. And to really, the thesis of the book, I think, for me in the writing, which is a reflection of how I feel about everything, is that that hierarchy begets violence. That it is it both creates violence and it is upheld by, reinforced by violence. So when you have a power structure, like in the book, for example, a patriarchal society, or in my life, right, in the US, a patriarchal society or a racist or ethno-nationalist society, a white supremacist society, that power structure in which one group sort of favors itself, or one person says, well, I'm better than, or I'm, more valuable than you are. I matter more than you do. It's reinforced a lot of times by physical violence, by the threat of physical violence, but also by a range of sort of oppressions and belittling. And one of those is just overlooking people, just saying, you don't matter. I'm not even going to pay attention to you or what's going on with you or your community or your family, because it's not worth any time to me. It doesn't matter at all. And I think that carelessness, I hope that the book provides in fiction some examples of what that carelessness can do, and how much it hurts, not only how much it hurts everybody, how much it hurts everyone up and down that power structure, all the way bottom to top. That, for example, when the ethnic Russian wealthier characters in the city completely disregard the indigenous Kamchatkan characters in small towns, that has real consequences for everybody. And it's not a benign or harmless act. And certainly to me, that is, I can think about 45 different examples from today's news in my city that seem to reinforce that particular way of seeing the world. It seems like that is, at least to my eyes, reflective of how we function, or at least how my society here functions.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Like, I didn't want to force you on the live stream to write a book of philosophy as well. I think you've just done that. Before I would ask you to read us a few pages of the book in the beginning, I have a last question for like this section. So you've talked on other on shows, at other events, on live streams about what first sparked your fascination for Russian culture. And it's this very cute story that you like had a crush on a camp counselor. I really like that. And it went on from there, and you studied a lot and got really interested, read all the books. And we know what the outcome is. Um, Actually, it got me to thinking as well, beyond that, because like not every crush sticks, but this one did. And what could be more to that? And I kept thinking about, we're about the same age. I think you're like 2 years or 1 year younger than me, actually. And so we have we've lived the same amount of time basically in the world. And I was thinking if it might have something to do with this idea that we are especially fascinated with the period of history that's just beyond what we can consciously think about. And that is the Cold War in a way, like the whole period from the 50s, late 40s, 50s, up to 89, which was the time where we still both little kids. And so I was thinking, I mean, the Soviet Union plays a major role in the book. America plays a major role in your life, obviously, in mine as well, working for a Transatlantic Center. Do you think that might have a little something to do with your fascination for this culture that Americans still find a little weird?
I think 1,000%, absolutely. And I think you are so right about this particular moment in time where we were born in a moment where the Soviet Union existed, and then before we came to sort of consciousness, it was already gone. I am so interested in specifically that time of the kind of post-Soviet transition. For me is the most fascinating time. Last years of the Soviet Union, the 90s in Russia. Now, in fact, there were that moment and that fascination is a big reason I wanted to go to Kamchatka in particular, because Kamchatka had such this region. Of course, the entire country of Russia went through an immense change with the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, that is, we know that, but Kamchatka had a particularly, like looking at it as a microcosm, really had a remarkable shift from being one of the most, it enjoyed a lot of status, it enjoyed a lot of importance and focus, and was really strategically vital, and protected and well-funded. And at the fall of the Soviet Union, that just absolutely, all of that went away. And that is so interesting to me. That's why I wanted to go there, really. That, and also that I would do these Google image searches, and it seemed like the most beautiful place in the world. And I thought, okay, well, 2 birds with 1 stone. I mean, you can't get better than this beautiful and interesting place. But I think you're really spot on, because I don't know how you feel, but whenever anyone says to me, sometimes folks will say, oh, well, I went to Moscow in 1985 when I was in high school. We went on a trip to Moscow. Or, I remember I went to St. Petersburg in the 70s, or I went to Leningrad then, not to St. Petersburg at all. That something about that is so interesting, to think that that folks went to this place that we'll never get to go, that we'll never get to go to that country. We'll never get to be with Soviet people. We'll only get to be with Russian people. There's a huge emigre community here in and around New York of Soviet emigres, and it's so interesting that like the country that they left in the very late 80s, very early 90s is now no longer there, and the last that last place that they left is gone now. Something about that is so compelling to me, and it's just such a compelling thing. I didn't really think about how it is, I think, perhaps tied to the particular moment at which we were born, and it shifted for us. It just is fascinating. I remember being in 2nd grade and coming to the bus stop for school, walking to the bus stop for school, and someone was there with their babysitter, and she was from Yugoslavia. And she said, I'm really sad today because Yugoslavia is, I don't know how she explained it to us in second grade, but like Yugoslavia is over. There is no more Yugoslavia. And the idea of that was so, I mean, I was very, very little, and something like that, I didn't even know that was possible. And it really opened up my little, very tiny world to the idea that there were other people in other places in the world that were having very different experiences than I was that morning. It was, for me, a very memorable bus stop journey. So certainly, I think there's something really rich and engaging in this place for us.
Yeah, actually, I feel absolutely the same way, not only with Russia, but also with like this, a third of Germany is like a ghost country with a totally different past. We cannot really imagine much about if we are like West Germans of like 30 something years of age. And actually, like when I was a kid, people in the West talked about East Germany being like a satellite state of the Soviet Union. After it went out of being as dark Germany, there was the word for it, like dark Germany, like a shadow place, like a underworld. And actually, in preparing for the talk, I read something that Stefan Zweig wrote about, the famous Austrian novelist and world viewer, like a genius author, one of my favorites. And he went to Russia, and I think that connects to what we just talked about, in 1917, just after the revolution. And he wrote about it like from this very Austro-German person of the 19th century perspective, and it must have blown his mind. He wrote it down beautifully, but it's like entering a completely different world, which is just beyond imagination. Like Russia had a revolution, Lenin is there, and it's just like entering another world. And I'm wondering if like, even if like history has moved on, was coming to Kamchatka something like that for you, or is it different?
Oh gosh, well, I'm dying to read that. I really want to read his impressions, because talk about a place we'll never go and can't imagine. Going to Kamchatka was a completely, yes, it was another world for me, but another world in lots and lots and lots of ways. I was, it's always funny to say this, I was very young, and now I'm very old and grown up, but I was very, very young. I was a year out of university. I went to university, 20 miles from where I grew up. I really had lived all of my life in a very small circle. And I had spent time in Russia before. I'd spent months in Moscow before, and in Western Russia, but I had never lived anywhere. Frankly, I'd never lived anywhere. I'd never been to Alaska in the US. I'd never been to Minnesota or Maine. I'd never been to a climate like Kamchatka's, or places as rural as many of the places I visited on Kamchatka. I'd never been to a place with so little infrastructure. And that's not particular to Kamchatka at all. If I had moved, to, I'm sure, rural Oregon here in the US, my mind would have been blown, all of it, and my world would have been completely changed. But it really, really, really was an immense education for me. It just took everything I knew about the world and kind of turned it upside down and shook it out. It was absolutely like, it changed everything. It was another world for sure.
Well, I think this is actually the perfect moment to dive into the book. And I would like to tell people in the meantime that it would be a good moment to, if you have questions we haven't talked about at all, because of course we have to keep track of time as well. You can already type them into the chat, and a few of them I will read to Julia in the beginning, at the end of this. I'm sorry. But first, let's go to Kamchatka with Julia and hear a little bit from the beginning of the novel, actually.
And yeah, is it okay? It's about 5 minutes. Is that a good amount of time? I'll read a little bit from the first chapter. I'm going to read just a couple pages from the very first few pages, and then I'm going to skip forward to read a short section. And I wish I was reading from the German edition. I'm reading from the US paperback here.
British one.
Perfect. Sophia, sandals off, was standing at the water's edge. The bay snuck up to swallow her toes, gray salt water over bright skin. Don't go any farther, Alyona said. The water receded. Alyona could see under her sister's feet the pebbles breaking the curves of Sophia's arches, the sweep of grit left by little waves. Sophia bent to roll up her pant legs, and her ponytail flipped over the top of her head. Her calves showed flaking streaks of blood from scratched mosquito bites. Alyona knew from the firm line of her sister's spine that Sophia was refusing to listen. You better not, Alyona said. Sophia stood to face the water. It was calm, barely touched by ripples that made the bay look like a sheet of hammered tin. The current got stronger as it pulled into the Pacific, leaving Russia behind for open ocean. But here it was domesticated. It belonged to them. Hands propped on narrow hips, Sophia surveyed it, the width of the bay, the mountains on the horizon, the white lights of the military installation on the opposite shore. The gravel under the sisters was made of chips from bigger stones. Alyona leaned against a block the size of a hiking backpack, and a meter behind her was the crumbling cliff face of St. Nicholas Hill. Water on one side, rock wall on the other. They had walked along the coast this afternoon until they found this patch, free of bottles or feathers, to settle. When seagulls landed nearby, Alyona chased them away with a wave of her arm. The whole summer had been cool, drizzly, but this August afternoon was warm enough to wear short sleeves. Sophia took a step out and her heel went under. Alyona sat up. Soph, I said no. Her sister backed up. A gull flew over. Why do you have to be such a brat? I'm not. You are. You always are. No, Sophia said, turning around. Her tipped-up eyes, thin lips, sharp jaw, even the point of her nose annoyed Alyona. At 8 years old, Sophia still looked 6. Alyona, 3 years older, was short for her age, but Sophia was tiny all over, from waist to wrists, and sometimes acted like a kindergartner. She kept a row of stuffed animals at the foot of her bed, played pretend that she was a world-famous ballerina, couldn't fall asleep at night if she caught even one scene of a horror movie on the TV. Their mother indulged her. Being born second had given Sophia the privilege of staying a baby all her life. Gaze fixed on a spot on the cliff far above Alyona's head, Sophia lifted one foot out of the water, pointed wet toes, and raised her arms to 5th position. She tipped and caught herself. Alyona shifted her seat on the stones. Their mother always tried to get Alyona to take her sister along to classmates' apartments, but these little misdeeds were exactly why she would not. Instead, they had spent their summer vacation alone with each other. While Sophia balanced, Alyona looked along the shore. A man was picking his way over the rocks. Someone's coming, Alyona said. Her sister splashed one leg down and lifted the other. Sophia might not care who saw her act like an idiot, but Alyona, her forced companion, did. Stop, Alyona said, more loudly, heating up in her mouth. Stop! Sophia stopped. So I'm going to skip forward a few pages. Alyona and Sophia end up meeting that man, and he's sprained his ankle on the path. So they help him back to his car, and as thanks, he offers them a ride home, and they accept. So this next really short bit I'm going to read is when they're in the car with him. From the passenger seat, Alyona took the man's features apart. A wide nose and a mouth underneath that matched. Short brown eyelashes, round chin. His body looked carved out of fresh butter. He was too heavy, probably. That must be why he had stepped clumsily on the shore. Do you have a girlfriend? Asked Sophia. He laughed and shifted gears, accelerating up a hill. The car hummed underneath them. The bay drew away behind. No, I don't. And you're not married? Nope. He lifted his hand, fingers spread to show. Sophia said, I saw already. Clever thing, he said. How old are you? 8. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. And you're also not married, am I right? Sophia giggled. Alyona turned to watch the road. His car was taller than their mother's sedan. She could look down on roof racks and along the pink lines of drivers' arms. People were sunburned after this one day of good weather. Can I put the window down? She asked. I prefer the air conditioning. Straight through this intersection? Yes, please. The trees along the sidewalks were fat and green from this rainy summer. They passed ragged billboards on their left and concrete paneled apartment buildings on their right. Here, Alyona said. Here. Oh. She twisted in her seat. You missed the turn. You missed the turn, Sophia said from the back. I want to take you to my place first, the man said. I need a little more help.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna applaud silently for everybody in the audience. That's always a challenge with online readings now, as you well know probably. So before I pose my next question and maybe lead us into a different direction, I want to read you a beautiful comment by Marlies, who doesn't have a question. She just wants to let Julia Phillips know how so very much I'm enjoying listening to her thoughts. So I would agree with that, actually. So
oh, that's my favorite. That's so nice. That's so nice.
I think like the opening actually mirrors something in the book, which is a theme, I think, and that is Kamchatka is this very otherworldly, ghostly place in a way, and you've already talked a little bit about this. And I think like this history of it being like a military zone for a long time still hangs in the air so much in the novel, even though it's not like a war novel in any kind of way, of course. But it also reminds me of the famous film by Tarkovsky, Stalker, where there's this zone, which is like this forbidden place where people cannot really enter into. And if they do, things might happen to them, like dangerous place, of course. And I was wondering, having experienced this yourself and then writing about it from a remove, maybe, does it feel to you like Kamchatka is more of a, maybe both is true, but like a closed society or close-knit society? Or is it like in constant play with each other?
Gosh, what? I love the way you put that.
Because the military is like quite a closed system, of course.
Yes, I would say, so in my limited experience there, I was very surprised at the persistence of the feeling of isolation, the feeling of separation from the mainland. As you say, Kamchatka was closed previously. So during the Soviet Union, foreigners weren't allowed to visit. Russians had to get special permission from the government to visit. It really was quite specifically a military zone for people to be posted or for people who were already there to stay. And there were no visitors at all. And now there are quite a few visitors. I mean, relatively, it's a hard place to get to. But, you know, lots of adventure tourists, eco-tourists, people that want to go hunting and fishing and snowboarding on their amazing mountains. And so I think I expected that closed feeling not to be there at all. And in retrospect, that was really naive. The military still has quite an active presence there, and they're closed. In the first chapter, Alyona and Sophia look across the bay at this military city across from the city, the capital city where they live, and that military city is a closed city. Still, you can't go there unless you have permission. And there are still a lot of sort of actively embedded defenses and secrets and things that are cut off from the public. And Kamchatka in general, I think because of the lack of infrastructure, there aren't roads or railways that connect it to the mainland. It feels like an island, and it feels cut off in general from the mainland. And unfortunately, a lot of communities there feel cut off from each other because of that lack of infrastructure. So even if, it's no longer like a military restriction on traveling to many places on the peninsula, there's still just a practical restriction in that there isn't an inexpensive or easily accessible way to go from place to place unless you have access to a helicopter, or unless you're a really great dog sledder and have a lot of free time and can spend a lot of time going from place to place. And I think that makes it feel closed off, both to outsiders and to the folks who live there from each other. At the same time, I was really blown away. I hadn't experienced, being there was the first time I had experienced what I've come to understand is a not uncommon quality in communities that around the world where there's less infrastructure, that if you don't think like the authorities are going to step in and help you out, and if you don't have, if there's no evidence that someone else is going to do it for you and your neighbors, then you're going to have to do it yourself for you and your neighbors. And people really, really, really went out of their way to take care of each other, to take care of me, to watch me and make sure that they were sort of building a safety net under me. I was quite clearly out of my depth and really naive about what was going on. And I was blown away at how strangers, even folks who maybe didn't like me very much, still felt a responsibility toward me to ensure that I was safe and taken care of. And that's so different from my experience in New York, I would say, and growing up, where it very much seemed more like, everyone for themselves. No one's going to be knocking on your door making sure that you got home all right or anything like. And that was a really, really special quality for me to learn about, and one that I think I'm still chasing after and trying to learn from.
Yeah, that's very well put, I think. Actually, before we hand off to maybe 2 questions from the audience, which are trickling in now, and Doris Wolters is going to close the evening for us with her reading part in the end. I have like one last question I was trying to ask you, because something that's very common in the reception of the novel is at first people, like the first thing people learn about the novel is its title, and the title and a little bit also the American cover suggests a story about climate change and ecology. And actually it pops up everywhere. Actually, like the review in our local paper in the Badische Zeitung, which I mentioned in the beginning, it starts off with that. Like, you expect a novel about climate change, and what does she do? But actually, I think it's connected in such interesting ways, because the title stems from a folk saga, basically, where a piece of land actually disappears, and that's what's going to happen if climate change continues, as we all well know. And then I got to thinking about a video from the Russian government I saw on Twitter, actually, a few weeks ago, where they had like this, I mean, that was before the Suez Canal and the tanker getting stuck, but they had these giant oil ships moving through the Northwestern Passage. It's a passage, yeah, which is gonna be open soon because of climate change. And I think the Russian government is quite happy about that. And so I was thinking, like, this is a very different approach to a changing climate and to parts of our Earth maybe disappearing, as you know. Is that something like, did you want people to like draw this conclusion and then go off somewhere else and just like continue it in more subtle ways, or did it like spring up on you?
So it's so funny. So the title of the book is something that I imagined from the start of the project. And I always had the idea that someone else, if I were ever lucky enough to find a publisher, that publisher would have a very savvy marketing person who would come up with a very cool and catchy title, and it would be a million times improved. And then that didn't happen. We just kept on. We tried to come up with a million different titles, and this one just kept feeling like it was the best fit because, as you say, it refers pretty explicitly to this story of this town that washed away. That is kind of a framing for the whole book. But when the book came out here in the US, it came out the same month as a book called Losing Earth and a book called The Uninhabitable Earth. And they were both nonfiction books about climate change. And I was like, oh my God. and I like what you say about the reviews, because somebody last year it interviewed me. They sent me interview questions and it was very clear that the interview questions, it was for a magazine, like an online publication about climate change. And all the questions were like, how does the book relate to climate change? And I was like, oh, it's a novel. It's not really, it's not really explicitly about climate change. I love what you say there, that if that's what if folks feel that I wrote the book wanting it to explicitly give a feeling of dread and the understanding that anything, the ground is shifting under our feet and anything can be lost at any time, and that we need to act together to change. If people connect that to climate change and are moved to go beyond this book to learn and do more, that is the best thing I could possibly imagine. I think climate change is quite clearly the most urgent crisis facing humanity and the planet. That it's without a doubt the number one thing that we should all be thinking about and acting on. But was I thinking about it when I wrote this book or gave this? I was not. I'm afraid to say, and I hope for some. That shift in behavior I just described, I am hoping for in my own life still.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, you wrote it over a period of 10 years, so it only grew in importance. And I think also a novel constructs new frames of reference all the time, and people are going to continue to read the book and see different things in it. And
hopefully.
Before Doris is gonna close the evening, I have picked 2 questions from the many questions that came in the general chat as well as in mine, which I found especially interesting. Please don't be mad if yours didn't get picked, but we are on limited time. So Misha wants to ask, are any of the characters are going to come back in any way? And of course, I think you cannot talk about that. What about the ending? I've been thinking about it a lot after I finished the book, and probably others did too. I think we have to be careful there to get the care thing back, because not everybody has read the book.
Yes, and I will say, this is how I try to speak spoiler-free about the ending if you haven't read the book yet. One thing I want to say about the ending is you can always email me if you have any questions. My email's on my website and we can always talk about it. Another thing I would say is that I think this is spoiler-free and true whether you've read it or haven't read it. I wrote the ending to be not open-ended, to be like a specific, to me it's important that the question of what happened to the girls, I think as a reader, I always want to know the answer to the questions that are posed by the end of the book. And I meant the ending to answer that. And I also meant it to be as real as everything else in the book. I've learned since the book came out that people have different reactions to it and interpret it different ways. I didn't know that was even possible. So I've been learning a lot about craft. When it comes to the characters coming back, I don't think I don't know what'll happen. The imagination is a mysterious place, but for me, what was compelling about each of these characters and each of these chapters, I really tried to focus in on the moment that to me was most mysterious and exciting in my understanding of them. And when the chapter ended, it ended because I felt satisfied. I thought, okay, they're going to go off, and I can imagine the rest of their lives, and I don't feel the need to write it down, or oh, you know, she probably does this or she probably does that, and I feel I've gotten enough in the ways our lives have intersected here. I don't feel the need to go back and revisit. Who knows what'll happen, but that's how I feel now anyway. I don't think any of them are coming back. But I think about them still, they're my friends.
I mean, you still have decades like of writing novels maybe, and so maybe there'll be like a crossover episode.
Yes, maybe.
So the second question from the audience by Elsa is prejudices against and discrimination of indigenous people and immigrants are central topics in the book. How do these prejudices and patterns of discrimination play out differently in the US, and what similarities are there?
The way that I wrote the book, the way that I intended to write the book, I hoped for something that would feel resonant and specific and recognizable to folks in Kamchatka who, like, I hoped one day I'd be lucky enough to have them read it in Russian and say, yeah, I see this. I recognize this world. This is the world I live in. But most overtly, while I was writing it, I was thinking about racism and white supremacy and ethno-nationalism in the US. That I wanted to better understand the dynamics at play at home for me by also trying to understand the dynamics at play in Kamchatka. There are lots of things that are different about Kamchatka in terms of than in the US. The most glaring to me is that the understanding of race that is in the book, specifically the mapping of ethnic Russians as white people, is such an American conception. In the conversations I had with folks in Kamchatka, race, ethnicity, people talked about ethnicity all the time. People talked about whether someone was ethnic Russian or Ukrainian or Even or Edelman, or ethnicity was always a conversation. But race in the way that I have it here, whiteness, is just such an American framing. And that is very strongly in the book because it is very strongly in me, and it is a way that I came to understand. It's an unremovable bias. It's a filter that stays on forever for me in terms of a way of engaging with the world. It's like a way that is culturally fundamental to how I exist. and so it was never possible, unfortunately, I guess, or it is what it is. Objectively, it was never possible for me to be having a conversation in Kamchatka with an ethnic Russian who was saying, oh, I went to a march today about keep Russia for Russians and that we don't want people who aren't Russians to be here, and not interpret that as or understand that as whiteness, that what they were talking about was whiteness. But that's my filter, and that's my bias, and that is much more, I think, American. It is much more American than it is Kamchatka. Another big difference, I think, and I tried to put this in the book, but I don't think it's as strongly in the book as it is in reality, is that Sovietness is kind of the overwhelming. People would talk about being, in the US, painting with a very broad brush, the people who want to make America great again, or like go back to an earlier time, or are nostalgic for a previous time, are almost over that. You can really map that racially, that it's a lot of white people who desire that return. In Kamchatka, a lot of the people who wanted to go back to the previous time, it's like a generational divide more than anything. A lot of people who lived during the Soviet Union, and no matter their ethnicity or class or kind of where they are, whether they're in a really rural community, whether they're in a city, really, 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 really would like to go back to the Soviet Union. If they remember, if they lived through the Soviet Union at any period, even if they were young people, very young people during the 80s, they want to go back to the Soviet Union. And that was such a different mapping for me of kind of like race and nostalgia, or ethnicity and nostalgia. And that was something I tried to, that felt so specific to Russia and to Kamchatka for me. I tried to put that in the book as much as possible. Because I think as an American, it was so surprising.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, I just got another direct message to me that someone is joining us from San Francisco, California, and it's an odd benefit of the pandemic, yeah, to join a German cultural program for sure. But great that you're here. Before we close with Doris reading the German part from Das Verschwinden der Erde, published by DTV, which you can get at the local Jos Fritz Buchhandlung if you are in Freiburg and not in San Francisco, because they've stocked up on the German as well as on the original version. So buy your book there and not on Amazon. I'm sure we can agree on that. Give me 1 second to say 2 sentences in German about forthcoming programs, if you are interested in that. Wir setzen die Reihe Transatlantic Tuesday fort, an jedem Dienstag in den nächsten Monaten, bis wir wieder Live-Veranstaltungen anbieten können. Wir machen natürlich eine kleine Osterpause, aber am 14. April haben wir Harry Kunzru zu Gast, auch in New York lebend, der uns Red Pill vorstellen wird. Mit ihm darf ich auch sprechen. Das war eins meiner Bücher des Jahres, also melden Sie sich jetzt schon an, wenn Sie möchten. Und am 20. April spreche ich mit Emily Temkin, US Editor of The New Statesman, des großartigen britischen Magazins, die ein Buch über George Soros geschrieben hat und mit uns über die Zukunft des jüdischen Amerika sprechen wird. Darauf freue ich mich auch schon sehr. Also richten Sie sich Ihre Ostertage zum Anmelden ein, wenn Sie möchten. Und wenn es Ihnen heute Abend gefallen hat, können Sie uns immer mit einem Unkostenbeitrag von 5 € unterstützen, damit wir auch in Zukunft noch trotz Corona-Krise spannende Gäste einladen können. With that, I will hand off to Doris Wolters, who will read us a little bit from a later chapter of the book. As the closing of the evening, I'm going to say good night to you after it, so you won't go off into the night alone. And now it's over to Doris. Hi, Doris.
Hi. Valentina Nikolajewna hatte ein Bläschen auf der Brust, das nicht heilte. Dunkel auf der sommersprossigen Haut, die bei offenem Kragen sichtbar war, etwa 4 Zentimeter unter dem Schlüsselbein. Es hatte mit einer kleinen Blase begonnen, die allmählich größer wurde, platzte, verkrustete und weiterwuchs. Unter der Oberfläche war sie blutgefüllt. Mit der Zeit würde sie von selbst heilen, dachte Valentina. Nach jedem Duschen klebte sie ein dünnes Pflaster drauf. Das Bläschen schmerzte nicht, aber sein Aussehen, die fleischige violette Farbe, war beunruhigend. In den ersten beiden Wochen sprachen einige Leute sie darauf an, doch nach einem Monat fiel es niemand mehr auf. Das Pflaster gehörte zu ihren Eigenheiten, so wie man einen albernen Hut trägt oder gerne pfeift. Ihre Tochter ignorierte es. Nicht einmal ihr Ehemann störte sich daran, wenn sie im Haus aneinander vorbeiliefen. Sie glaubte, die Stelle käme von der Arbeit im Freien. Vielleicht hatte sie sich verletzt, als sie sich über eine Schaufel beugte. Nach Dianas Geburt hatte Valentina ihren Mann dazu überredet, dass sie alle zusammen so viel Zeit wie möglich auf ihrer Datscha verbrachten. Und die Entführung der beiden Mädchen im August hatte dem, was sie ihm seit 10 Jahren predigte, noch mehr Nachdruck verliehen. Die Familie, sagte sie, gehe über alles. Ein Kind, das in einer eng verbundenen, liebevollen Familie aufwuchs, wäre sicher und gesund. Sieh dir doch die Alternative an. Eltern, die sich von ihren Pflichten drücken, Kinder, die sich im Stadtzentrum herumtreiben, Grundschülerinnen, die wie vom Erdboden verschluckt sind. Jetzt sorgte Valentina dafür, dass sie die Wochenenden zu dritt verbrachten. Valentinas Mann ärgerte sich über die 40-minütige Fahrt aufs Land und Diana, die immer mehr zum Teenager wurde, meckerte. Doch Valentina ließ sich nicht beirren. Für sie war die Arbeit im Gemüsegarten befriedigend. Hinterher entdeckte sie immer irgendwelche Kratzer, blaue Flecken oder Krusten. So schön es war, einen kleinen Garten außerhalb von Petropavlovsk zu haben, es barg auch Risiken. Valentina bekam ihren eigenen Raum, ihr eigenes Fleckchen Erde, musste aber alle Verletzungen und Unannehmlichkeiten akzeptieren. Es war im Spätherbst. Ihr Gemüse war unter einer dicken Schneedecke begraben, als Valentina vom Waschbecken der Schultoilette aufblickte und sich des buckligen Heftpflasters im Spiegel erneut bewusst wurde. Mit nassen Fingern zählte sie nach. Seit April hatte sie jeden Tag ein neues Pflaster darauf geklebt. Seit mehr als einem halben Jahr. Mit 41 war Valentina noch nicht alt, aber mit den Eigenarten ihres Körpers vertraut. Ihre Handgelenke waren in letzter Zeit schwächer geworden. Die Härchen auf den Beinen heller und dünner. Sie und ihr Mann hatten schon als frisch verheiratetes Paar Abstand zueinander gehalten und seit Jahren überhaupt keinen Sex mehr. Und sie hatte ihre Brüste schrumpfen sehen, als wäre es eine Reaktion darauf. Dennoch war sie zuversichtlich geblieben. Im Büro wachte sie über den Etat der Schule und zu Hause über Dianas Schulaufgaben. Valentina war stolz darauf, wie sie ihre Zuständigkeiten meisterte. Den Garten, die Küche, die Schulakten und gewiss auch ihre eigene Haut, hätte sie gesagt. Beim Anblick des leuchtend braun-violetten Flecks im Spiegel packte sie plötzlich die Angst, all diese Kompetenzen einbüßen zu müssen. Als sie die Monate zusammenzählte, bekam sie einen Schrecken. Am folgenden Freitag ging sie in der Mittagspause endlich zum Arzt. Er beugte sich über ihre Brust, um das Mal zu untersuchen. Es war jetzt erhaben wie ein Knöchel und steinhart. Immer noch klein genug für das Pflaster, aber definitiv größer als am Anfang. Das ist was Ernstes, sagte er. Ihre Hand fuhr zum Brustbein. Sie war in die Praxis gekommen, um eine präzisere Antwort zu erhalten. Wie ernst? Sie müssen ins Krankenhaus. Warum? Fragte sie. Es ist doch nur ein Bläschen. Können Sie das nicht hier gleich erledigen? Wir sind nun nicht dafür ausgerüstet. Die Stelle muss so schnell wie möglich entfernt werden. Wir rufen im Krankenhaus an und Sie gehen am besten sofort hin. Valentina sammelte ihre Sachen ein, folgte ihm in den Empfangsraum und bezahlte ihre Rechnung. War es Krebs? Wenn es Krebs war, hätte er es ihr nicht gesagt. Es war Krebs. Manchmal klärten Ärzte ihre Patienten nicht auf. Wenn die Krankheit unheilbar war, behielten sie es für sich und ließen die Leute langsam und ahnungslos sterben. Valentinas Großmutter war auf diese Weise gegangen. Sie hatte stückchenweise ihre eigene Lunge ausgehustet. Valentinas Mutter hatte die Tür zum Schlafzimmer geschlossen und die Grippe gesagt. Jeder in der Familie wusste Bescheid, aber keiner machte eine Bemerkung. Heutzutage sagten sie es einem. Man konnte Krebs behandeln. Es gab Tests. Und es war keiner. Wäre es Krebs, würde sie es wissen.
Vielen Dank, Doris. So with that, there are many thank yous and clapping hands trickling in the chat right now. One of them from Mountain View, California. Like we have like a California base here. So that's what the German American Cultural Institution is all about, I think. So thank you, Doris, for reading tonight in German. The book is Das Verschwinden der Erde, published by DTV Verlag in German. It's Disappearing Earth, published in English, which you can also get at the local bookshop if English is more your cup of tea. I want to thank all of you. You're thanking us, but we're thanking you for streaming with us tonight and being here, even though the first try was a bit more bumptious, but it's great that we could get together again and make this come true. And most of all, I want to thank Julia Phillips for coming again and talking with us and with me about her just gorgeous and masterful book, which is so immersive, and you should absolutely please read it. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so special. And I feel really lucky that we got to do it twice.
Well, that's one way to see it. Yeah, please check out our next events. I wish you all a very happy Easter. Relax with your families, with your friends, if they're in your close circle or your bubble or whatever your local government says. Be careful, stay healthy, and I hope to see you soon. Goodbye, good night.